leadership role in the development of herb formulas and participates in the education of health professionals worldwide. She is a principal architect and trainer in the First Line Therapy Lifestyle Medicine Certification Program. Her anthropological training and participation in functional medicine community in presentations with a unique cross-cultural perspective and appreciation of the importance of integrated medicine. Lyra maintained a consulting practice, a member of both the American Herb Products Association and the AHPA Education and Research on Botanicals boards. Good for You, Smart Choices in Hormone Balancing is her first book, which was released on October 2003. And now, without further ado, here is Lyra Heller.
Everybody, and thank you, Adam. It's my pleasure to talk to you folks today about a focused approach to fighting stress. And in the next 15 minutes, we're going to review stress physiology with an emphasis on a new concept that isn't discussed as often, called allostasis. Then I'm going to share with you the Identity Stress Assessment Program, which is designed to sort of help you as a practitioner identify common stress patterns in your patient, and this will lead you to a very interesting and novel way to create protocols to help balance their stress response. And we'll also talk a little bit about simple behavioral tips, lifestyle changes, if you will, that your patients can actually integrate just through a little self-study and a little practice. So moving to the stress response, we all have been trained that the stress response is an adaptive strategy that's triggered by a need for change. And what you're seeing in front of you are 4 very common ways that stress is discussed. We know it's a biochemical event, and the stress itself is very individual in that everybody perceives stress differently, and not everything is going to trigger a stress response. We think something might be stressful for one person, and yet another person finds it actually enjoyable. Things like standing up, in front of an audience and performing. For individuals, public speaking will bring them to their knees, and for others, it exhilarates them and they feel like they've, had a religious experience on stage. So it's a very unique and individual process, this perception of stress. We know about stress as a fight or flight response, and when we really do feel that we are in danger, where we actually, know that our life imminently could be changed. And a very common way in chiropractic that, stress is perceived in the body is looking at it from the perspective of sympathetic and parasympathetic dominance. And then the one that we're going to focus on the most today is the allostatic response, which is a way of understanding a patient's ability to adapt to high levels of stress, and that basically we've evolved as a species to just really be stress hardy. So our nature is stress hardiness, and we learn to adapt, and perhaps in some ways it's our demise, because when we learn to adapt to high levels of stress, we actually don't realize our body is taking the largest brunt of our adaptive strategy. We know that stress is short-lived, and so basically we move between a fight-flight response, a whole rest and digest process of relaxation on a dime. And ideally, we do not ever want to stay in a sympathetic dominant state for very long. What's important, I think, for all of us to remember when we talk about stress is that the stress response is an upstream process, and it starts within the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus perceiving a stress at both psychosocial and systemic level that actually causes the stress response to engage, which allows us to understand that even though we think frequently about the adrenal glands as being a target of the stress response, the reality is if you want to work effectively with the stress response, you will be able to change how the hypothalamus perceives the body's emotion level and also how a person perceives events. So you modify behavior, you can modify perception, and you can change biochemistry. So what you see in front of you right now is the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal. And the reason we're reviewing it is because the players in this particular cascade of events are corticotrophin-releasing hormone and adrenal corticotrophin hormone and cortisol. And you'll notice off to the left, you'll see adrenaline. And so basically, we live in a state of parasympathetic dominance, but they're also in a state of readiness, so that we can, based on how we perceive our environment, have a metered response or a measured response to stressor. So we have internally the ability to respond appropriately to a stress response, so we don't overproduce stress hormones. What's important also to realize in this illustration is that noradrenaline, norepinephrine, is actually the first of the stress hormones to be elicited when you perceive stress. And it's upon the release of adrenaline that you then wake up, and then the hypothalamus then immediately starts to move downstream to signal the release of cortisol. So that wake-up call from adrenaline is then modulated by the release of cortisol, so that when you are under stress and you're trying to come up with a problem or solution to a problem, the cortisol really calms you down, reduces the level of inflammatory signaling, and allows you to function at a much higher level of awareness once your stress response is aroused. So you have tremendous beneficial short-term effects from cortisol. It helps in coping and solving problems. And part of the body is then focused on the central nervous system, the ability to produce adequate energy to drive the body so it can respond at a high-performance level. And in this sense, your body is able to perform appropriately. The other aspect of the stress response, which is important to remember, is that it is a circadian rhythm, and we were designed as daytime animals to have high levels of stress hormones potentially available to us during the day, and then as we go into nighttime and the sun goes down, we slip into an opportunity to rest and relax and go offline. And so what happens is that at bedtime the cortisol levels tend to subside naturally as the body prepares to sleep, and then melatonin begins to rise, the sleep hormone. And so the purpose of looking at what normal circadian rhythm is for stress is important, because we see that the stress response is turned on appropriately. Oftentimes that cortisol level will go up in the evening, and when the cortisol level goes up, it's going to interfere with melatonin. So often when people have difficulty sleeping, it's really valuable to give them stress-reducing and very powerful tools behaviorally that they can use at bedtime, which will literally take them offline, turn on the relaxation response, and turn off cortisol to melatonin to express itself. Note that the long-term effects of cortisol and the catecholamines, the norepinephrine, are extremely destructive. They affect literally every organ system in the body. Chronic fatigue, adrenal exhaustion at the very extreme end, when the body can no longer respond appropriately to stressors. And if we look at this particular slide, it sort of captures very colorfully all the organ systems involved. So you can pick whatever circle you want to in terms of your sphere of practice to understand how stress would be influencing a person's health. So in chiropractic, it can contribute tremendously to fatigue, muscle weakness, muscle tightness, accelerated bone loss, central nervous system disturbances, chronic inflammatory conditions. So that the ability to recognize when stress is activated in a person's body is very valuable in helping them achieve balance and also resolve problems. So, in summary, overexposure to stress hormones, just the general flooding of the body with catecholamines and cortisol inappropriately, is probably one of the major reasons why people visit doctors. It's linked to the leading causes of death. It contributes to all sorts of behavioral issues, and it's also one of the reasons why people eat poorly, they quit lifestyle programs, they practice substance abuse, because people are driven to self-medicate. The acute and chronic stress can range from mild to intense, and these are the domains where you see your patient show up with symptomatology, and you can always be suspicious that the stress response being turned on inappropriately could be one of the contributing factors to the cardiovascular issues, upper respiratory, energy level, emotional difficulties coping, not being able to concentrate, and certainly digestive issues. Also, clues to the fact that your patients are going to be struggling, with stress is that in general, we self-medicate when we're feeling really stressed out. And they're the classic patterns. We have our special comfort foods. We wake up in the morning on coffee. We go to bed at night on wine. We tend to overwatch TV. We have a couch potato syndrome. We overwork or we oversleep. There's a group of people who indulge in risk-taking behaviors as a way of, being connected to life and distracting them from things that, stress them out. So, in the realm of what we all have been trained to understand stress to be, I'd like to just transition into the concept of allostasis, which was introduced in the late 90s, and Bruce Ewan is one of the primary spokespersons for this model. And basically, it's reminding us that we have the ability to achieve stability through change. In other words, we can learn to cope with the high level of stress, and that's a very valuable thing for us because in industrialized modern life, we are asked to manage a tremendous amount of stressors, from this level to environmental pollution, of noise as part of that, to crappy diets and irregular sleeping patterns and incredibly long work hours. And again, the allostatic model forces us to shift to what goes on in the hypothalamus. That if we can modulate the way the hypothalamus perceives stress, then we can turn on the relaxation response. And so this particular illustration is demonstrating that the hypothalamus perceives stress, and those stressors can be happening on an environmental level. It could be due to trauma abuse, it could be major life events, and we respond to them differently, as I mentioned earlier. But what's most important is that these stressors come in the form of systemic stressors, biochemical stressors, structural stressors, as well as psychosocial stressors. The other thing that McEwen's model helps us look at when we are trying to understand the stress response is that you have different ways of responding. You have what's called a normal stress response, where you're able to engage in a problem-solving task, and then the stress response ultimately turns off. Then, if you're not so lucky as to have a life where problems actually are contained and structured so that you can actually solve problems, that there's a beginning, a middle, and an end, you run into a situation where you're constantly dealing with stressors. You're constantly at some level either physically or psychologically feeling threatened, and that leads to what would be a prolonged stress response. And under the same circumstances of bigger stress, your body will ultimately move to where you have an inadequate stress response. Because to stay in a state that's prolonged will ultimately lead to a state where your body can no longer respond appropriately. Each of these particular patterns, whether it's prolonged or inadequate or normal, demonstrate a certain set of symptoms. So what you're looking at here in an allostatic model is a pattern of overactivity of the HPA axis and a pattern of underactivity to stressors. And each of those responses on the part of your stress system has consequences. When you look at a prolonged stress response where people are experiencing an overactivity or a flooding of corticotrophin-releasing hormone and cortisol and the spectrum of catecholamines and cortisol, you see a high level of nervousness, a sense of panickiness, difficulty sleeping, and sometimes people suffer quietly. They just feel incredibly mildly agitated. And they find it hard to, wind down, and they also get intolerant and sometimes angry easily. They fly off the handle. And on your left, you'll see some examples of patterns of biochemical imbalances that can be triggered by this type of a prolonged stress response. And so really what you're looking at here is a person constantly seeing stress as present, constantly feeling threatened at some level. So the corticotrophin-releasing hormone, the ACTH, which then leads to elevated cortisol, which then leads to elevated glucose and elevated insulin, etc., is constantly activated. And so what you're looking at in these prolonged stress types is a tendency to metabolic syndrome. Your relationship between stress and insulin is very intimate. When your body is under stress, it causes glucose to be mobilized, so cortisol immediately asks the body to release glucose, which in turn will stimulate insulin. So it isn't any wonder why individuals will ultimately suffer metabolic syndrome, triple obesity, weight gain around the middle, because of this interrelationship between glucose and insulin. And they also have patterns that could contribute to the symptom at your level of having excess catecholamines, the norepinephrine, the adrenaline surge, which directly deals with heart rate and blood pressure and heart rhythm, and the inability, for example, for the cortisol to quiet down the excess catecholamines appropriately. So it's like you're always staying in that heightened state of catecholamine excess or adrenal dominance. Both of these are possible patterns through a prolonged stress response, but again, it's an individual response. The degree of expression of these kinds of chemical imbalances are, highly unique to the person and very difficult to measure. The examples of articles which focus on corticotrophin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus actually being involved in depressive disorders, and here's another example of what happens when cortisol excess happens. It can affect dementia, it can affect cognition, because what cortisol will do is it will enter into the central nervous system at different neurotransmitter sites and can block the expression of serotonin, for example. So you can have high cortisol levels in the body, and they can affect the expression of serotonin, which is a homeostatic neurotransmitter, which brings calm and release. And so by balancing the HPA axis, by helping the body to put out a more appropriate stress response or appropriate level of corticotrophin releasing hormone, which would produce a more measured amount of cortisol into the bloodstream, you can control the degree to which the stress response might influence mood. In terms of the thyroid, you also have the relationship between subclinical hypothyroidism and depression, and that's because elevated corticotrophin releasing hormone has the ability to actually suppress thyroid function. Another example of what I call the heart-brain connection, again, going back to the circadian rhythm, you're looking at corticotrophin releasing hormone on your left, going through the normal circadian pattern, the normal dark light pattern where it's lower at night and higher during the day. And when you shift over to the right, you see what happens when you induce stress. So ultimately, whatever happens downstream in terms of the production of cortisol, if you follow the right panel down all the way to the bottom, you'll see that elevated corticotrophin releasing hormone automatically can contribute to elevated cortisol. So this pattern that you're looking at here is really starting upstream, and also elevated corticotrophin releasing hormone directly affects our vasopressin, which affects heart regulation and heartbeat and blood pressure. So this is where your heart connection comes in. It's the relationship between the hypothalamus and the release of arginine vasopressin. If we look at an inadequate stress response or an inability for the HPA axis to respond appropriately when challenged, the primary expression of this is apathy, depression, and fatigue. So you get this inertia, this lack of affect, this general sense of feeling just I can't move, I can't act, and it can express itself as chronic fatigue syndrome. On the right, you see a number of possible scenarios biochemically that could be happening. Again, in this particular inadequate stress response, you could have increased corticotrophin releasing hormone hypersecretion, which would be so high that the pituitary itself, the receptors in the pituitary, would turn down, and the pituitary gland would not be stimulated, so that downstream the adrenals would not hear the message to produce cortisol, leaving a person at a high state of agitation or leaving a person very groggy. So it's very difficult at times to know when inadequate stress response is clearly because the actual adrenal glands have been fatigued, we normally assume they are, or the adrenal glands are just incapable of responding appropriately to the stress response and aren't putting out enough cortisol, therefore allowing the body to be filled with inflammatory messages inappropriately, simply because of the hypervigilant response of the corticotrophin-releasing hormone. Currently, there are no real tests, but what is important is we can get a sense of what's going on with the adrenals if we do an adrenal stress index, if we remember that sometimes it isn't the adrenals themselves that are fatigued, a hypervigilant action upstream in the hypothalamus that may be the need for coming down. And that's one of the reasons why we talk to this idea of stress patterns in the use of botanical adaptogens, because you can, with botanical adaptogens, target the hypothalamus and directly corticotrophin-releasing hormone, so you can actually produce a balanced HPA response, as opposed to focusing therapies on the adrenals themselves. So most of your botanical solutions we'll talk about are really a top-down intervention, as well as your cognitive therapy, behavioral tools, a lot of the stress tips, that you'll see in some of the handouts that we'll provide you with, or even if it's something along the line of breathing exercises or meditation or physical activity, really the activity is happening at the hypothalamus and allowing the relaxation response to turn on and calming down corticotrophin releasing output. Looking at here are possible patterns that lend themselves to botanical and micronutrient strategies as a result of this sort of binary response. So you have this prolonged response and you have this inadequate stress response, and each of those areas, that binary or that model, will give rise to a series of patterns. And so as we go from left to right, you'll see that these kinds of stress patterns are really looking at exposure to prolonged stress hormones over time. Assume that most people are pretty stress hardy to begin with. Where to start? We developed a stress assessment program that helps identify patterns. And it reads very simplistically because in a sense it's kind of easy to identify those patterns. And we call it, what is stress type? Are you wired? Are you worried? Are you just occasionally stressed? Are you inflamed? Are you always fatigued? What does that pattern look like? And the program is quite, logical, and it's very simple. It involves 3 steps. To identify the stress type, you bring in specific stress relief tips and dietary recommendations based on just general eating habits that the average American has and that your patient probably indulges in, and correct some of those kinds of choices. And then you can pick a nutraceutical or botanical type of intervention which directly balances the stress response and helps it to be more balanced in response, to just living day-to-day. This type of a program, what we call the Identity Program, operates on 3 levels of stress. One, it operates at the level of perceived stress by allowing you to look at the emotional and cognitive response to a person's life. So one of the things about the identity stress assessment, which is important, is that it's talking to the patient at the level of how they're processing their world on a day-to-day basis, at the level of emotions and at the level of mental processing. It doesn't get involved in the physical response. If you were to want to understand the possibility that physical would be responding to stress, you would work with either the health appraisal questionnaire or something along the lines of the metabolic screen questionnaire, which is a basic review of organ systems. It is possible in this particular stress assessment that a person isn't reacting emotionally or cognitively to the stress in their life. They're actually reacting physically. But there's some value in just capturing a person's phenomenological experience of life. It also allows you to make distinction between eustress and the prolonged and inadequate stress responses that are associated with the allostatic theory. So in a sense, we're applying this kind of binary model. Are you in prolonged stress, or are you responding in an inadequate way? And both of those kinds of extreme responses lead you to match very specific nutraceuticals. Because if a person is in a prolonged state, the natural tendency would be to calm the person down. And groups of supplements and botanicals that are known to have a calming effect, and then a person is truly launching an adequate response, meaning they should be able to excite the immune system and the stress response to help them to cope better with what's going on around them. There are things you can do that would actually restore balance, but also gently stimulate in a healthy way. And then there's the issue of eustress, and that's that stress happens and everybody's under stress and people need help just to get through the day, just to sort of take the chill out, and you're able to actually make a discernment between the eustress and the prolonged and inadequate stress response. The other clinical benefits of the Identity Personalized Stress Assessment is that it's a great rapport building tool, and it engages the patient in sharing how they're feeling day to day. I mean, most people are not willing to necessarily go into depth about what's bugging them or what's irritating them on a day-to-day basis, and oftentimes they kind of suffer silently. And this allows you to have that conversation because most people cannot resist filling out a stress questionnaire. They always want to know how stressed they are. And so once you start this conversation off, it's an opportunity to educate them about their relationship between food and stress and how they're eating. It helps you to rationalize, again, the importance of structural and musculoskeletal and neuromuscular work, because that non-balanced is a contributor to turning on the stress response. So it allows you to think about how you can reinforce the current therapy that you're doing with your patient as well. And it creates an opportunity to offer your patients lots of interesting stress reduction techniques and targeted supplemental support. And most importantly, it tracks progress on a subjective level, and almost everyone benefits from seeing where they've come from. So this is what the form looks like. I have to just go through the logistics of it with you and talk a little bit about scoring. You'll be able to review through an online tutorial how to go and score this again after this webinar. So what you don't get from my discussion can be reinforced through links that you will be emailed after this presentation is completed. And so what you're looking at is a two-page questionnaire, front and back, and it consists of 5 sections. Section A is a section we talk to when we say the person tends to be wired, and Section B is when they're worried. So the manifestation of those two patterns is primarily between feeling generally nervous and anxious and tired and difficulty falling asleep. But a lot of that tension is felt in the heart. You can experience rapid heartbeats. You feel tension in your chest. And oftentimes it's people who are very type A that express the Section A symptomatology. It's a very common state to be in when you're not sleeping enough, you're not eating 3 meals a day, and you're ultimately feeling just exhausted, but you're a high-performing individual. Section B, where you're worried, that is where most of the tension and most of the stress is actually held mentally. It's like your brain is constantly on the move, constantly agitated, and so it's a mental agitation state. You lie awake in bed thinking about big things, little things, things that have bothered you all day, and in a sense it almost feels irrational, but you can't turn your mind off. Sections A and Sections B are classic patterns of what would be called a reaction to the prolonged stress response on a psychological and an emotional level. Section C is sort of the mediating section, and it contributes, the way a patient answers those questions contributes to both the prolonged response and the inadequate response, because it really talks about the actual of the adrenals as far as you can do so through symptoms. In other words, it's looking at whether or not the adrenals are actually putting out adequate cortisol to meet the needs of the patient. And the symptoms are essentially what we call pre-Addisonian symptoms, as the adrenals become fatigued and tired, or the adrenals' inability to respond shows up on a physical level. And so, patients who are on pain medication, anti-inflammatory medication, have a lot of muscle and joint soreness and pain, lots of tender points. They crave salt. They get dizzy when they stand up. These are more of the physical manifestations of the adrenal glands under definite stress. And always look to identify where the adrenal glands are at by looking at a salivary cortisol and DHEA stress adrenal index. This is an example of a flat circadian rhythm, but at least, if you're really wondering where you would go to find out what's going on with the adrenals themselves, then I would think that the stress adrenal index is fabulous for that. So sections D and E, which then move you into the realm of the inadequate stress response. Section D talks about expressing an inadequate stress response by being mentally fatigued, not being able to stay on task, not being able to think clearly. You're not feeling very motivated, you're not trusting your own judgment, but basically a lot of the way you manifest that stress is occurring within your executive function activity. Then you move to section E, which is really just tired, you're exhausted. And so if you were to look at the two extremes of the identity stress questionnaire, section A is about just being really revved up, overworked, overtired, completely agitated due to just exhausted reserves. And E would be the opposite end, where you're not launching an adequate stress response. You may also have exhausted reserves, but the expression of the exhaustion is that you truly are tired. You're chronically inflamed. You really are suffering from inadequate amounts of cortisol. So section A to the far left, so to speak, would be excess cortisol, perhaps, and if you want to frame it that way, and section E would be inadequate amounts of cortisol. But again, that tends to be a little simplistic, but at least it helps to visualize what's going on biochemically downstream. At that part of this questionnaire, you'll also find some lifestyle and health questions. We consider this to be really one of the quickest reviews of what's going on with the patient. It's down and dirty. It's 9 questions. It's asking the person how they perceive their level of stress, and that's important to find out, because what if the patient scores are basically very low and the person sees themselves as under a lot of stress? What this is suggesting is that it's probably manifesting at a physical level. So a lot of people can be just happy as can be and cope and appear to be solving problems on a day-to-day basis, and emotionally and cognitively they're focused, they're high energy, nothing gets them down. But if you ask them if they're under stress, they'll tell you, I am just so under stress. But they may have autoimmune disease, they may have hypertension, they may have other manifestations on a physical level. Again, this brings up the HAQ or it brings up the MSQ. And so that's an important understanding to be able to get from your patient. You want them to be able to identify what those stressors are, in their life. Typically, they will focus on social and work-related issues, familial issues. And as you go to questions 3 and 4 and 5 and 6 and 7, etc., you really go to the nuts and bolts of how they're maintaining their body. Are they feeding their body so their body is capable of withstanding the stressors? So if you don't feed your body, if you don't treat it with respect, then ultimately you lead yourself into exhausted reserves. And so some of the most fundamental areas that you can help the patient with is getting them to eat breakfast. And in this kind of a realm, a medical food can be unbelievably helpful just to start the day off. If it's a metabolic syndrome type of individual, they can start with an ultra meal. And if it's a person that tends to be inflamed, you can start them on a program that would be more clearing, metabolically clearing, or hepatically clearing. You want to encourage them to, have some type of physical activity in their life. You want to be able to identify how much water they're drinking and how much coffee. So this is a very quick way to help give them some advice that might put them in a place where their ADA axis, their stress response, is more balanced and supported and nourished in a way that it could be more appropriate. So we offer you stress-reducing techniques, the level of dietary guidelines, and as well as just basic, quick way to reduce stress. And these can be downloaded off a toolkit, which you'll be having access to through links. The 9 tricks to reduce stress quickly are very effective. They're very inexpensive. You can do them anywhere at any time. And they draw heavily on cognitive therapy tools. In terms of dietary guidelines, you can download this off as well. It talks to the patient about the relationship between eating breakfast, the importance of micronutrition, importance of essential fatty acids. And so by helping the patient have some very specific action steps they can take in their daily life to reduce they're stressed physically, this is another great way to help educate them. And we all have available a great stress relief tool. It's a guided imagery and belly breathing self-study CD for your patients, and it helps them to understand how their body holds stress, where in their body they hold stress, and most importantly, Track 3 is a fabulous way for your patients to learn how to belly breathe and immediately turn off the stress response. Nothing faster than breathing, nothing. Return for a moment to the identity assessment, and let's talk a little bit about how you would score it in relationship to actually choosing the appropriate supplement. So I want to remind you that there is a tutorial on this, and I'm going to hope that as I walk you through this, it makes sense to you. I described earlier that the stress assessment questionnaire, the identity questionnaire, has 5 sections, and those 5 sections are A, B, C, D, and E. So the first step you want to do when you are scoring is you simply want to have the patient sum up the sections A, B, and C. When you get the questionnaire, you will see that each section has the ability to be scored. And so what you're looking for is to score either the individual sections, and you're looking to score section A, B plus C, and section C, D plus E. So this is where everything starts, because what you're actually trying to do is you're trying to determine the degree and intensity of the stress in everyone's life. So these questions are scored based on the frequency with which a person experiences any given symptom. If a person says they're nervous and it's a 1, it means they rarely experience being nervous. But it's a 3, it means they're experiencing being nervous a lot of the time, maybe 5, 6, 7 times a day. The scoring is based on the frequency with which people are actually saying they experience symptoms. So eustress, when you add the sums of sections A, B, and C, if the total scored sections A, B, and C is less than 35 points, or if the sums of sections C, D, and E are less than 35 points or equal to, then the individual is under normal stress. So stress would just be considered normal stress. This is the way we live our lives. And you have a scorecard which allows you to also be walked through steps. So the tutorial and the scorecard are part of the process of scoring. What happens then is if a person is under prolonged stress, each one of those section sums will be greater than 36 points. The moment any one of those sums is greater than 36 points, you have opportunity to identify whether the person is under or exhibiting a prolonged stress response or an overactive stress response or an inadequate or underactive stress response. And what you're looking at here is the way in which you interpret those sums. Once again, eustress, both section sums are going to be less than or equal to 35 points. You then move to seeing which of those sums is higher than the other. The moment one set of sums is greater than 36 points, you will begin to see a pattern emerge. So what you're doing is determining stress intensity here on the first step, and then when you do the second step, you want to then choose the path. You're going to ask yourself, is the patient over or underactive? The sum is the path. So if you see the sum of A, B, and C is greater than 36, for example, and the sum of C, D, and E is let's say less than 36, then you know automatically that that individual is going to be on a prolonged stress path. And so determining whether the person is overactive or underactive is ultimately the goal of that particular first 2 steps in scoring. Notice that section C, which was the adrenals, is added to each one of those sums, and the reason for that is, as I had said earlier, adrenal function contributes to both sides. So what's happening in the adrenals, their level of functionality, is extremely important in understanding, its contribution to whether the person is in a prolonged state or overactive state or an inadequate or underactive state. And so therefore the sum of the adrenals is added to both sides. And the last little green sentence here where it says additional adrenal support, looking to make a decision, do the adrenal glands or ultimately will they need additional support other than what we'll be talking about in the next slide. And that's really a question of, your judgment call, and you'll see how this plays out in a moment. And the third step is choosing the pattern within the path. So by this point, you decided whether the person is in a prolonged state of stress or is in an inadequate state of stress, and at that point, you can make a decision between supplements, and I'll show you the protocol at a glance slide in a moment, simply based on which of the sections under that particular path has the highest score. Ultimately, to use this particular questionnaire, you just have to determine whether they're a prolonged state or they're in an inadequate state of stress response. And once you have them in either one of those paths, you stay in any of the products that fall under those particular major paths are going to be comfortable for you to use. But as you become more comfortable with the questionnaire, you can begin to discriminate more between the products within each one of those major divisions. What you're looking at here, which is on the back of the scorecard, is a way to make recommendations. And so the first that was about was the stress, and stress type of pattern, which is going to be 30 points or less in both sides, whether it's the sums of A plus B plus C or the sums of C plus D plus E, meaning both paths are literally not active in a way that would be of any major concern other than just a normal response. A recommendation can be made to give what's called casein tryptic hydrolysate, which is a very interesting decapeptide. It's a very small peptide of milk protein that we'll talk about briefly that actually influences the stress response in a very positive way. Then when you look at the over-responsive types or the prolonged stress response, this is where you're looking at A plus B plus C, and notice that there are supplements that are recommended under these pathways that would allow you to put together a program. So if the person were stressed and wired, which is section A, the recommendation is a very unique traditional Chinese formula called Ramanya and Shizandra. And you'll notice that there's your score, 11 to 20. And then if you were to do a more chronic look, you could always add another level of support, which would be a theanine and DHA mixture. I want to stay at this level, the level of mild to moderate, for the remainder of this presentation, so that you're able to get a sense of, how to work. So let's go back up for a moment. You determined if the person was over-responsive or had a prolonged response. Either sections A or sections B are going to be dominant within this path. Do not make a mistake between the two formulas. So whether it's Ramanya for section A or it's section B, which is Polygala Jujube, you will not hurt the patient, injure them. It's just you are able to refine your selection if you choose to look which of the two paths within the over-responsive pattern have the higher score. Basically, you never make a mistake by working with either of these formulas. Move over to the stress response. Using again, as I mentioned earlier, the scores are C plus D plus E, which would put you in the inadequate or under-responsive stress category. And as you go down this particular path, you will see that within the under-responsive types, you see either the section D or the section E would be a higher score, and that's what would lead you to choose either of these formulas for that individual. higher score under stressed and mentally fatigued would lead you to an ashwagandha and holy basil formula. The stressed tired would lead you to work with ginseng and cordyceps. So basically, as you can see, what you're trying to do is determine, is the person over or is the person under responsive? And in the middle, you have an overlap with what you want to independently support the adrenal glands. And to summarize, on that level, I had said, if section C has a score of greater than 10, you may want to add a licorice ammonia combination, and that would be to either side. So if a person was over, you could add licorice ammonia to whatever you chose to work with in the over-responsive side. If the person was unresponsive, you could choose licorice ammonia to support either of these products should you choose to go that path. Typically, if the score is less than 10, you wouldn't really want to consider that. Very often when patients are on steroid medication or on anti-inflammatories, the score may be artificially low. So a trigger for whether you would want to add the licorice ammonia mixture would be whether or not they're on pain medication. So concluding this protocol at a glance, you're looking at over to the left and under responsive to the right. They're opposites. And many doctors frequently just work with the Ramona-Schisandra formula and the ginseng and cordyceps formula, and gradually work into making the distinction between the finer patterns that exist within the two major paths of over and under activity. So let's talk about eustress very quickly. I talked about casein tryptic hydrolysate. It's for an exaggerated response to daily stress. It leverages the goods of the mother-infant connection. Actually, the science of casein tryptic hydrolysate originated in France. They were trying to understand, what is the relaxing and calming properties of breast milk, and what they basically discovered was that milk has the ability to break down in the presence of high trypsin levels in an infant's gut and release a series of very neuroactive and relaxing, you could say, natural constituents. And one of these that they discovered was this casein tryptic hydrolysate, and it's in tablet form. And at 150 milligrams, you get a very relaxing sense of, or relaxing sensation, a sense of calm in the face of stress. So you have this sense of awake calm. And to give you a sense of how concentrated it is, 400 glasses of milk will deliver to you 150 milligrams of what's in one tablet of casein tryptic hydrolysate. It's been widely studied. It's extremely safe. There are many clinical studies on the product really looking at its efficacy in a stressed population. Animal studies and toxicological studies, it's non-addictive, and the mechanisms of action appear to be through an affinity for the GABA-A receptor, as well as possibly having an influence on a benzodiazepine receptor. What you're looking at here is a composition of casein tryptic hydrolysate. You'll see it's a standardized 10 amino acid chain that comes from bovine milk. It's no allergenicity because of the small size of the peptide. We do recommend that if a person is truly milk sensitive, you want to be careful in recommending it, or perhaps you don't want to, but it's been used for the last 10 years very successfully and virtually no reactivity at all. We would suggest that this is the perfect eustress product, although you can use it with any of the adaptogens that I'll be talking to you about shortly. But basically, it's like a chill pill. You use it as you need it. You want to just take the edge off. You can use it on a regular basis. It's non-habit forming, as I mentioned, and these are the examples of the kinds of acute stress responses people have when they're faced, with daily challenges. It can happen in any part of your body, and that would be the indication for using it. But when you go back to the identity stress questionnaire, what's most important to remember is that the recommendation of this product is going to typically be where the scores are less than 36 points in either of the two sums. So less than 36 in sections A plus B plus C, and less than 36 in sections C plus D plus E. Because what's saying is that I have occasional stress, and people like to have something on hand that they can use, especially through the holiday seasons. It's very easy to use, and it's 1 to 2 chewable tablets a day. You take them twice a day. This is what we recommend. Using more is not going to hurt you, but I think it's overkill. It'll either work at this level or it won't. So let's move from eustress to looking at more targeted nutrition for stress patients, where the scores on the stress questionnaire exceed 36 points. So we first pass on supplements to support the stress response. We recommend adaptogens. And the reason we recommend adaptogens is because they are very effective at, I'd say, reducing the damaging effects of chronic exposure to over and under production of stress hormones. They have a very broad impact throughout the body. Now, adaptogens have a web-like property, and that web-like property means that it influences multiple organ systems. In the West, specifically, we see that adaptogens share similar properties. When we said we know they're non-toxic, they help reduce the hyperexcitability of the hypothalamus, if you will, to perception of stressors. And so where there's an exhaustion or an overexcitation process going in the body, it seems to help at the level of the hypothalamus to just not have this exaggerated response. However, the botanicals that are called adaptogens actually differ in their impact on the stress response. So if it were true that they were all doing the same thing, all you would need to do is just set scope on one adaptogen, and it would be one size fits all. But in doing that, you really lose the ability to tune your programs and to really tap into the traditional aspect of how you would use these adaptogens. Because not only do the adaptogens have a shared ability to calm down and balance the stress response, they also have different organ affinities in the body, as well as they have different capacities to balance, to calm, and to stimulate. So if you will, you can make a recommendation for a particular adaptogen that will actually excite different parts of the body where excitement is required, such as an inadequate stress response, where a person, let's say, when under stress, manifests fogginess and poor decision-making. An adaptogen that helps balance the stress response, the immune system, but also perks up mental capacity a little bit more than another adaptogen would be a preferred way to go. And traditional classification systems help us to understand what some of those unique and individual properties are of these different adaptogens. So what I'd like to do is to start off with, and this is very brief, and be able to review this archived presentation at your leisure. I'd like to start off with a mild to moderate stress response, and I'd like to look at Rehmannia and Schisandra. Looking at here is the second formula, Rehmannia and Schisandra, and it's for people who feel burned out, who are anxious and apprehensive. And if you look at this web, you look at all the points of the web have different organ systems that your adaptogens actually can target. And so with this particular formula, you see that it is specifically calming to the HPA axis. It somewhat works in insomnia. It has a very balancing effect, but it has a very strong influence on the cardiovascular system, mood, and blood sugar. So when one looks at the symptoms that are expressed, you see difficulty sleeping, you see hypertension, you see tachycardia, heartbeats, a kind of nervous energy that you can't calm down, you feel internally agitated. In general, you can cope well, you can think well, but it's your body that's really feeling the tension and the anxiety. This comes from an very old Chinese herbal formula called Tianwan Bushendan. And if you note, you'll see that the symptoms are palpitations, restlessness, uneasiness. This is something that you can trust. The cool picture of this particular formula is well established, and it's used widely in traditional Chinese medicine. It's a very concentrated water decoction, and when you have an opportunity, you can review the logistics of the distribution of the herbs based on their hierarchy of what they attend to in the body. It's important to note that Mania glutinosa, which is the chief herb in this particular formula, has been demonstrated to be very profound as an anti-inflammatory. And from Chinese medicine perspective, it takes the heat out of the body. It's very anti-inflammatory. And it works in hypoglycemia. It's used widely for diabetes. It works as anti-inflammatory, as I mentioned. And so from the perspective of its influence on balancing metabolic syndrome and the inflammatory aspects of metabolic syndrome, it has a profound effect when the patient is, as I had said a moment ago, very agitated. So this is a clinical summary. It's a traditional heart calming formula. Think cardiotonic, think calm, think nervous tension being released, think being able to sleep at night before you go to bed, heat the body, heat out of the heart. So the next formula would be the one that still falls under the over-responsive path, and this one we call Palgala and Jujube, and this is the one with the agitated mind. Looking at its impact within this web of potential efficacy, it very much focused on insomnia, but in this case, muscle tension, chronic pain, and heavily on mood. Very different than its other partner, which is Ramanya formula, which focuses more on the cardiovascular tension, the heart-brain connection. Here you're looking at tension release, you're looking at mental restlessness, you're looking at agitation, and looking very much at the inability to sleep at night. Both formulas may share a similar overlap in terms of symptoms, but the way you would differentiate this particular formula choice would be this is all about agitation in the mind and inability to sleep because of constantly having the mind overthink things. So this is an interesting formula. Traditionally, it's called OmniNPN. Again, a very interesting mixture of herbs. And I'd like to call your attention to one particular herb in the formula called Polygala. It's called the will strengthener. And this is an herb that has very direct and very specific cognitive and I guess you could say neurotransmitter-like effects in the brain. This is an example of some of your chief herbs that are in the formula. Here you have Polygala tenuifolia. As I had mentioned, it's called a will strengthener. And in Chinese psychiatry, in traditional Chinese psychiatry, this is shown up as one of the very interesting plants of choice in calming the brain and working with a more type of obsessive compulsive repetitive type of behavior pattern. Current science on this particular plant shows that it may have a very interesting influence on the NMDA receptor, which is a glutamate receptor in the brain, which is the target for many of the medications that are used in schizophrenia and extreme anxiety. So in summary, what you're looking at is a product that's very suitable for daily use. It's used for that worrying and staying awake and fretting type of a profile. As we move to Sen-C, we are looking at the adrenal type, and you're looking again at scores of greater than 10. Again, it's licorice. The question of to use licorice or not to use licorice is really going to be based on the degree of physical manifestation of inflammation in the body and dependency on pain. Again, you can go either side, you can use them with either levels of formula. But in this particular mixture, you're talking to a very concentrated licorice extract, and licorice extract is going to be your source of glycyrrhizin, and glycyrrhizin is that particular part of the licorice that has a cortisol-sparing effect. And so its effect on the body is very profound. It allows you to reduce the amounts of steroid medication that you're on because it will allow a little bit of that medication to go much farther. Likewise, for patients that are inflamed and they're not on these kinds of heavy drugs, it has a cortisol-sparing effect on endogenously produced cortisol. And so use this type of an extract to preserve and support adrenal function is profound, and it also has tremendous healing benefits because licorice not only has the cortisol-sparing effect, it has anti-inflammatory and healing flavonoids that are known to be very powerful. There's a suggestion that if somebody has hypertension that you would not use this, and you don't have to worry about pseudoaldosteronism or a secondary type of hypertension, because the way in which you are going to use this is to not use more than 100 milligrams of glycyrrhizin from this licorice extract a day. This is an example of other herbs that are there to support the formula. You'll notice that the mixture of withenia and rehmannia are present, and it it pulls in both the over and underactive adaptogens, which allow this to go both directions. So you'll notice down here it says directions: 100 milligrams of licorice extract supplying 100 milligrams glycyrrhizin daily is considered safe for long use. And in other words, this is a typo. So what this should say is you use a licorice extract, and you use a licorice extract, you want to look to be sure that you are not giving more than 100 milligrams of glycyrrhizin daily. So this is a bit of a typo. So you could give 50 milligrams of licorice extract, that would give 100 milligrams. You could give 1,000 milligrams of licorice extract, that would supply 100 milligrams. The focus is going to be on the amount of glycyrrhizin. The last two formulas before we close are basically moving towards your underactive, your inadequate stress response. And the first that I want to look at is addressing section D, and this is ashwagandha and holy basil. So this is where you express that mental fatigue, that inability to think clearly. And in this situation, you're looking at a different group of adaptogens. This one is based around ashwagandha. It's balancing, but it also is mildly stimulating, whereas the other two products we saw was a relatively balancing and calming effect. So in Rehmannia formula and in the Polygula formulas for sections A and B, the point of this web was more on calming, and here it's more on balancing and somewhat on stimulating. And this particular mixture draws from the Vedic tradition and the Rasiana classification, in which plants are literally described in terms of their ability to affect the mind and the body. And in this particular formula, the lead herb is ashwagandha root, and it has a tremendous ability to enhance both immune function and also has an excitatory effect on neurotransmitter function, which is why it's placed in the position of being a cognitive activator, and it's very useful as an adaptogen where your thinking processes are off a little bit and you're not able to make decisions clearly or remember or take tests well when you're under stress. I know that ashwagandha boosts brain function, that has a cholinergic effect, and the holy basil tends to modulate cortisol, allows the body to use cortisol more effectively, and these are a variety of studies that you can read on your own time, which allow you to see that both glucose and cortisol are modulated by the effect of the addition of whole basil. We know Brahmi is definitely a mental activator, and finally the addition of amla supports the gut and the immune system, and activates the immune system in the gut. So herbs in this formula activate cognitive function, activate immune function, and activate gut function, so that the whole body is uplifted at the same time there's a restorative process going on. In terms of Ayurvedic medicine and heavy metal content, our Metabotanica triple certification process ensures that every botanical that goes into any product that we sell is completely safe and clean. There's no toxic metal burden, there's no environmental toxicity, and that's part of what we call our Metabotanica triple certification guarantee. This is an example of your cool summary, and again, this is what you will get from using ashwagandha, holy basil type of blend. It will lift both immune function and cognitive function. And we look at ginseng as your, master stressed and tired adaptogen, and in combination with cordyceps and rhodiola. But again, you're looking at the ability to uplift the whole system, improve glucose tolerance, improve and stimulate the whole system. So look of a stressed and tired person is a person who's literally hypofunctioning on all levels, regardless of, what organ system is involved. You can't get out of bed in the morning, you oversleep, you may have unwanted weight gain, you look clinically hypothyroid. So this particular mixture supports and improves adrenal health and HPA balance at the same time. It rejuvenates the entire body. It draws from ginseng, which is one of the most valued herbs in China and one of the most widely used herbs throughout the world. It's very powerful and very wonderful in enhancing all aspects of the body. We know that it influences the hypothalamus, and it allows for improving cortisol sensitivity throughout the body, a much more balanced response on the part of the hypothalamus, and use of adrenal corticotrophin hormone and corticotrophin releasing hormone. The proposed mechanisms are not really understood. They've divided all of the ginsenosides apart and looked at their individual actions, and the herb is a paradox because it's the mixture of ginsenosides in natural root, naturally occurring substances within the root that have its modulating and balancing effect and stimulating effect. We know that it's very neurologically focused. It works on blood sugar regulation, and quality of life improves with long-term use. Very safe, can be used long-term. You have no problems in terms of actually using it with medications. There's still a stigma associated with ginseng and hypertension, so we recommend you don't use it in that particular patient who has hypertension. However, if it were a true Chinese doctor who was managing it, it would probably be used as a therapy. The addition of cordyceps also strengthens all organ systems. Medicinal mushrooms are very powerful and profound, and cordyceps, again, is known to work on the immune system and bring up the immune response, because when a person has an inadequate stress response, typically they also catch colds frequently, and their immune system is not, responding as quickly as it could at the level of hand-to-hand combat with infectious invaders. Finally, you have rhodiola, again, very uplifting, stimulating, especially to the immune system, especially to the nervous system and digestion and the reproductive body, so that rhodiola adds a very nice addition, to the ginseng and the cordyceps. And the slide is just sort of helping you understand that when you are giving ginseng, when a person is truly exhausted, like in a chronic fatigue situation, you would want to give a lot. You would not want to give a little. And so when you look at how much to give, you're looking at dosing at the level of 2 to 9 grams of the main root a day in a decocted form. And it's very easy to be able to actually understand how much to give based on the directions that are on the label should you choose a product, because typically ginseng is under-prescribed and it's given for too short a period of time. So in this particular mixture, you're looking at a very intimate relationship between herbs, with rhodiola being at the smallest level, and rhodiola can cause some people a little bit of overstimulation, so therefore it's not present in this type of a mixture in very large amounts. So typically any over-agitation mixture like this could come from the rhodiola as opposed to the ginseng. So people are stressed and tired, exposed to prolonged elevations of stress that ultimately produce an exhaustion, are the best candidates for this product. But what you're looking at is true fatigue. In terms of sleep, this is another webinar, another discussion, and I thank all of you for being so patient with me. We've run over a few moments, and I do apologize for that, but I want to encourage you to view our sleep webinar at your convenience, and also to review the archived version of this when you have an opportunity. We do have, as I said, an identity stress relief toolkit. You will be sent the links. You can download the stress assessment, the scorecard, all of the tips and tools that we talked about that you can provide a patient with, and you can purchase the stress relief through guided imagery CD as well. And so we want to be sure that you know that you have all of these at your disposal. If you have any questions, for those of you who are still on, I'm happy to entertain them.
But the question is just a general comment to the group. We're sending that email out to you with all of those links that Vera has spoken of, and including a very exciting offer in regards to the specific products which relate to the ingredients that we're going over. So now questions. If you have questions, please in the chat section to the lower hand side, send your questions and submit them, and we will go over them and address them right now.
Hi, everybody. I'm just checking here, and so far I don't see any questions. Laura, you must have done a bit of a job in covering everything. Here we go. Do you have any insight on Parkinson's?
I have insight on Parkinson's, although I don't think it works within the context of this presentation. I think that, again, you would want to do a stress adrenal index, and you would want to understand the status of a patient that has Parkinson's. They could go either way. They could have an inadequate stress response, or they could have an overactive stress response. What you're really looking at is whether you really want to support acetylcholine and work with acetylcholine and a variety of other neurotransmitters that are known to play a role in movement disorders, like dopamine is another example. So that's a much more complicated discussion.
Are there any comments on nocturnal bruxism?
Bruxism, a bruxism would probably show up on the identity stress questionnaire as either sections A or B being elevated. You would see just a higher lung stress response or in a bruxism patient, most likely. It wouldn't be surprising. And in that particular individual, the PALA formula, the Poligula-GB formula, would probably be interesting. Now, in the questionnaire, you're not going to see bruxism as one of the symptoms. That would fall in the realm of a physical response. And I don't have the physical symptoms mapped out as over or under reactivity in a questionnaire yet, but it would be definitely falling under hyperactivity.
Thank you. Okay. So regarding the last two conditions, hypo, can supplements be used together? It says ashwagandha. Pardon me.
That's ashwagandha. So the question that you're asking falls on both sides. Both products or both formulas that fall under the inadequate stress response are complementary and can be used together simultaneously. This is true for those individuals who have a prolonged stress response. The formulas that were discussed were the Schizandra, the Ralmanius Schizandra, and the Poligula-GB on the prolonged response can also be used together. So there is no contraindication there. And the reality is that these formulas can be mixed pretty easily, even if they're coming from the opposite sides of the questionnaire. What I would suggest that you do in learning to use the assessment is you trust the scoring, and you allow yourself to do less is more, because these adaptogenic formulas have a tremendous and profound impact on calming or stimulating appropriately the HPA axis. So any one of those formulas on either of those sides can be very effective. And I'd encourage clinicians to begin to learn what the realm of efficacy is of these formulas before they mix them. But yes, you can mix them very easily. And as I said, the licorice mixture goes on either side based on whether or not, in your opinion, the adrenals need additional support. Most commonly, licorice is the one